Good morning. It's January 3rd, and let me say Happy New Year to you. It's a new year. We know that we've been through a lot last year. All we can do right now is to trust that the Lord is going to be with us no matter what we encounter this year. We know that we've made many jokes about last year, as tough as it's been. I even posted on social media that whoever was the last one to leave 2020, please turn out the lights and lock the door. And one of my cousins on Twitter then came back with, and throw away the key. Well, I know that we can make fun. I know that we need to be serious about some things, but it really is true that I hope that you will have a new and blessed, a good and happy and new, blessed new year. I'll get it out somehow. We're going to be looking at Mark chapter 1, verses 36 to 45. It's entitled A Personal Touch. We're continuing our series with a remarkable journey as the journey begins. Faith and hope is our study that we're going to be looking at. In a moment, we'll recite or go through a recitation of the passage that we're going to be looking at. But as we begin, I just want to remind you that as we read through the Gospel of Mark, to be looking at what the text tells us about Jesus. At the end, I will have a couple things to say about that, and then, of course, some opportunity for some personal application as well. It's a lot to think about. There's a lot that Mark tells us about Jesus' healing activity. And I will tell you that there are going to be some questions that come up in this text that kind of leave us perplexed. And I'll make some comments related to what potential answers there are for that. But at the end, there might be just some things that leave us perplexed. And we wonder what Jesus is doing in this passage. We might wonder even what some of the other people in the passage are doing. Well, as we begin, let me turn it over to Dr. Jim Spivey, our pastor, and let him offer up a reading of the text for us.
Simon and his companions went to look for Jesus, and when they found him, they exclaimed, "Everyone is looking for you." Jesus replied, "Let us go somewhere else, to the surrounding villages, so I can preach there also. That is why I have come." So he traveled throughout Galilee, preaching in their synagogues and driving out demons. A man with leprosy came and begged him on his knees, "If you are willing, you can make me clean." Filled with compassion, Jesus reached out and touched the man. "I am willing," he said. "Be clean." Immediately the leprosy left him, and he was cured. Jesus sent him away with a strong warning. "See that you don't tell this to anyone, but go, show yourself to the priest, and offer the sacrifices that Moses commanded for your cleansing as a testimony to them." Instead, he went out and began to talk freely, spreading the news. As a result, Jesus could no longer enter a town openly, but stayed outside in lonely places. Yet, people still came to him from everywhere. Simon.
Well, let's go ahead and begin looking at the text. As I said, today is week 5 or lesson 5, a personal touch. I do want to go back to verse 35 here in a moment, because that really does begin the passage. We use that as a conclusion to last week's passage, indicating a full 24-hour period of Jesus' ministry. We're going to be talking about an early morning, verse 35. Then in verses 36 to 39, we'll look at a greater mission. As you heard, Jesus decides that he's not going to stay in Capernaum. He's going to move about because he has come for that purpose. Then we'll look at the healing touch, or the compassionate touch, a personal touch, as your lesson says. We'll look at verses 40 to 42 in that regard and discuss a couple of things there. And then a neglected commission, verses 43 to 45, titled it that way. And because Jesus tells the man to do one thing and he doesn't obey. And in fact, his disobedience leads to some greater work for Jesus. Well, let's come back and look at the text and walk through it passage by passage and verse by verse. First thing I want to note is that as we go through the text, I often don't mention the parallels. I want to mention the parallels in Luke and Matthew before we move forward. I may come back to that. But what Mark has here in verses 35 to 45 in chapter 1, we have in Luke chapter 5, verses 12 to 16, and then also in Matthew 8, verses 1 to 4. The same message, the same passage, couple of little differences, but I'll let you go back and read those. I'll just come back in a moment to discuss the placement of this in the Gospel of Mark as compared to the Gospels of Luke and Matthew as we get down to there. But first, let's talk about the early morning. As you know, verse 35 begins with in the early morning, while it was still dark. I remember, I think it's the King James or another version says, a great while before day. Jesus got up, left the house, and went away to a secluded place and prayed there for a time. Now, I've just recited there for you the New American Standard Bible, the 2020 version, and they've added a couple of words there for clarity. He left the house, that's been added, and said he prayed for a time. For a time has been added to give you the sense that he was out there for a little while. But let me read it again because I want you to think about what Jesus does here. It says, early in the morning, while it was still dark, Jesus got up. He left, went away to a deserted place, to a secluded place, to an unpopulated place, and he was praying. He said he was praying there. A couple of things to note about that. We talked about that last week when, after a full day, he gets up very early. And I just want to point out here that as we see him praying, there are going to be other times when he prays, and we'll not always get content of his prayer, but we'll get the activity of his prayer. The fact that he does this early in the morning indicates that he wants to start off his day with his Father, preparing for what's going to come. We'll see later in Luke when he does this. It's right before he goes out and designates 12 of his disciples as apostles. And so we know that prayer is very important in the life of Jesus. The only application I can make here is that we recognize our need for prayer, our need to focus our day with our Father. I know that we could go straight into the immediate application, say we should wake up very, very early. And that's probably the best thing to do. I know that there is talk of others like Martin Luther who talked about how busy he was, that the only way he was going to get through it is if he spent a significant amount of time in prayer every morning. I think the point that we need to derive from this, at least in the life of Jesus, is to appreciate that here is one who is one with the Father, who spent a significant amount of time in communion with his Father and ordering his day according to what he was seeing the Father's will for his day to be. And so we'll see that. We'll see that as he's away, the disciples are going to look for him. But notice his desire and need to get away and find a place where he can pray to the Father. Well, let's move forward into the rest of the text. Verses 36 to 39, I've labeled a greater mission. It says that after he went off to pray, Jesus was praying, and then Simon and the others were looking for him, and they were eagerly searching for him. It's a word that really indicates they didn't know where he was. There's a certain desperation in there. We'll talk about that in a second. But they finally find him, and they say, "Look, everybody's looking for you." And so he says, "Well, let's just go somewhere else, and let's go to the towns nearby. And I need to preach there also, for that's why I came." So they go out, and he preaches in the synagogues. He will continue to work around the Galilee area. And along the way, along with his teaching, there is the preaching and also the casting out of demons. So let's take a look at this very closely. They are eagerly searching for him. Remember the night before, after the sunset, on the Sabbath, and it became the first day of the week, the people of the town of Capernaum come to the house of Simon. And as they do, they're concerned for the people that they love. They bring people that are sick, people that are diseased, people that have demons. And Jesus goes out and he heals them. And remember that Mark tells us that he healed many and he cast out many demons. We mentioned that that was not being restrictive, but that was trying to get at the fact that Jesus was very, very busy. Well, likely what happened is word continued to spread, and such that in the morning they went straight to Simon's house again. Only this time when they got to Simon's house, Simon and the others there, you assume that Andrew, his brother, is there, and James and John are all there. They don't know where Jesus is, and perhaps their own desperation is such that they know that they can't help the townspeople. It was Jesus doing all the work. And so what they do is they go looking for Jesus. And of course, their desperation is there's a lot of people out here and they're asking to be healed. They're wanting to see you. Well, Jesus then tells them that, well, we need to go somewhere else because I need to go into Galilee and preach into the nearby towns as well, because that's why he's come. That's why I've come. And it raises a number of questions. And one of the questions I have is, is he just avoiding the people of Capernaum? Is it that he's already done some work there and he needs to move on? I look at the passage and think, would it really have been a big deal for Jesus to heal a few people, say, I'll be back, I've got to go other places, and then go on to those places? Why not just heal some in the morning then and then move forward? But one of the things Jesus says is that he had to go throughout all Galilee. He couldn't stay in one place. He knew that his mission was to go out and preach the kingdom, and he would not be fulfilling his mission if he stayed in one place. Now, if you also keep reading the story, you know that he will come back from time to time. Capernaum is going to be a major place for Jesus. He'll be back in that synagogue soon enough. We'll see that in John chapter 9 after the feeding, or John chapter 6 after the feeding of the 5,000. He'll end up teaching in the synagogue there again. But we get a feel that as you read the gospel, he's been there and will be back. And if I can say it now, next week's lesson will be an event that takes place back in Capernaum. The key here is Jesus was out praying, preparing for his day, and he was going out to preach and to heal and to cast out demons in other areas. I know on the surface it looks very, if I can say it this way, uncompassionate that he wouldn't at least do some work there before he went on about his day. But notice what it says. In verse 39, it says that he goes out, and when he goes out into all of Galilee, he does these things. He's preaching in their synagogues. We know that that becomes a pattern for him, that he will teach and preach in the synagogues, probably throughout the week, not just on the Sabbath. And then he also is casting out demons. And there we have that activity again. We've seen that part of his ministry very early on, and it's included the healing, the preaching, and the casting out of demons. All of these part and parcel of his preaching the kingdom and demonstrating the arrival of the kingdom. And of course, as a result, we see that the news about him is spreading throughout all of Galilee. And so he's going into all of Galilee. Remember that the word was spreading about him the day before. And now, as he's going out, he's going into all the different places where word has been spreading about him. Now, a couple things to point out about this text. One, we see that Mark is giving us a very, very summary statement of Jesus' movement in Galilee. And it's at this point that the Gospels of Matthew and Luke will give us a lot more. In fact, the previous event is also mentioned in Matthew and Luke, but then there are several chapters in Matthew and Luke that intervene between the prior event and the events that we see in summarized in this text before we get to the healing of the man with leprosy. This is a very compact statement in Mark that covers a lot of territory. What we see in Matthew's gospel that intervenes is the Sermon on the Mount, other movements around Galilee where he's doing other teaching and preaching about the kingdom. Luke's gospel has about 4 chapters in between, and we just note that they all come back to about the same time when we get to this story of the man with leprosy. But Mark is giving us abbreviations here. He's giving us, as we've said before, a very quick overview of the ministry of Jesus. And so I want you to think about those other gospels at this point when it talks about Jesus preaching and casting out demons. The other gospels give us almost play by play on some of that, but Mark is giving us a little bit shorter version. He's got other things that he wants us to know about Jesus. And so that leads me to my second point, reminding us that while it's helpful to look at what the other gospels do and how these overlap with one another and where they overlap, let's go back and see what Mark is doing and why he's doing what he's doing. He makes a very quick statement about all the activity. And I hope that what that does is that it gives you a sense of his movements all around, and that what he's doing in the summary statement here is preparing us for what is to come up in a specific situation. So he's alternated back and forth. He's given us summary statements, then he's given us a specific statement, and he's given us summary statements, and then he's giving us a specific statement. If you go back to the beginning of Jesus' ministry, as he's beginning and preaching the kingdom and the kingdom of repentance, he does that. You'll see summary statements followed by a specific situation, and that's what he's doing here. So he comes back to the very specific situation, and we're told in verses 40 to 42 that a man is with leprosy comes to him. And most of the time in your modern Bibles, you're going to see the word leprosy with a footnote indicating that That word that is used as leprosy covers a vast variety of skin diseases. You can do research on leprosy and know that beyond being a skin disease, it also leads to certain types of paralysis and unfortunately the loss of limbs and so forth. So it's more than just a skin disease. But one of the things that's important about this text in calling it leprosy is the fact that in the Old Testament, there were certain stigmas, serious stigmas attached to this skin disease. And if you go back and look at Leviticus 13 and 14, you'll be able to see certain regulations relating to leprosy, meaning what would the person with leprosy have to do when they encountered it, what they would get to do and need to do if they find themselves healed of the leprosy, and how they can be reintroduced to the community. And so it's kind of interesting to see this man with leprosy coming to Jesus, because normally a person who is leprous would have to keep their distance. And yet this man sees Jesus, has probably watched him, and has also heard about him. And he comes to Jesus. And the New American Standard here says that he was imploring him. The man was imploring Jesus. So it was very clear he had a sense of desperation about him. And then he kneels before him. I don't know at that point you're seeing him worship Jesus, but certainly what you're seeing is a man who is submitting himself to Jesus. And then he says something rather interesting. He says, if you are willing, you can make me clean. Now, notice that beyond having a disease that makes him sick, in the community, it made him unclean and unfit for being in the community. So it's one thing for him to approach Jesus. It's another for him to recognize that his concern is being clean and all that would go with that. So he implores Jesus, he kneels before Jesus, but notice two things that he acknowledges. He knows that Jesus can make him well. He says, if you're willing, you can make me well. So he's aware of it. He knows Jesus can do it, but he also knows this all hinges on what Jesus is willing to do. He's acknowledging that it would be up to Jesus. So he's not telling Jesus what to do. He's acknowledging what Jesus can do, and he does put it out there for him, saying, Jesus, if you're willing, you could do this. And in verse 41, you're going to see a couple of things. The passage that you heard recited and the passage that you will see in the New American Standard is that Jesus had compassion on him. One of the versions of the New International Version says that Jesus was indignant. And it does raise a question for us. There are some manuscripts that say that. And one would be the question would be, why would certain manuscripts read that way? Jesus goes on to heal the man, so it seems kind of odd. The other thing is, why would Jesus be indignant? Why would he be angry? Or why would he be irritated or frustrated? Is it that this man is coming to him in the midst of all that he's doing, meaning Jesus being so busy in all that he's doing that he's got to take time to visit with this man? It doesn't seem that that's typically the case. Jesus has been very busy before, and of course, it's he who has gone out saying it was important to go into all these different places. So he knew his mission. But it does raise a question that he was indignant. It could be that one option is that he's actually indignant because the the sickness that is upon the man, the fact that he is sick, the fact that the man is leprous, that Jesus is indignant toward the sickness. Now, that's not my wording. The writer of our lesson in the study guide is Lee Powers. Many of you remember her when she and her husband were members of Gambrell Street while they were students at Southwestern. She wrote the lesson, and she leans toward the idea that he was indignant toward the sickness. It's hard to say. Certainly, we know that there were times when Jesus would become angry. We know that there are times when someone comes to be healed. He goes, "You guys just always look for a sign. You don't, you're always looking for something." He's done that with Jew and Gentile alike. Uh, I don't know why he's indignant at this point, if that's what the text originally said. Most modern manuscripts, or excuse me, most modern translations are going to go with the idea of compassion. There are many manuscripts that say that. I'll just say this: we could try and explain the indignancy, but we can also easily explain the compassion. And that is because he goes on to heal the man. So I'll let you wrestle with that a little bit. If you have a translation that says indignant, if you have a study Bible, you can look at a note to see what it says about that. But what we see take place is that he does talk to the man. He reaches out with his hand, it says, and he touched him. Now, Jesus is violating one of the laws, and that is you're not supposed to touch someone who is unclean in that way because that will make you unclean. It is interesting that this is not the only time that Jesus would touch someone who would be unclean, or in fact, the mother-in-law of Simon in the previous pericope, she had a fever and Jesus touched her. And so Jesus didn't have any problems with touching people in an act of compassion. He touches him with his hand. He doesn't become unclean, but he certainly makes the man clean. And notice he says immediately. It's rather interesting. There's one of those immediatelys again. Uh, Notice the immediately here, I think, means literally immediately. As soon as Jesus touched him, it says the leprosy left him. Not only was he healed, the text says he was cleansed. And that's going to be important for what's to follow. The man is then supposed to go and talk to the priest. Jesus is going to commission him to do that in verses 43 and 45. And that's why we call this a neglected commission. Jesus then sternly warns him and immediately sent him away. And he says to him this, see that you say nothing to anyone, but go and show yourself to the priest and offer for your cleansing what Moses commanded as a testimony to them. In other words, as a testimony to the priest. Well, what happens? He doesn't do that. He goes out instead and he begins to proclaim it freely and to spread the news around to such an extent that as we heard earlier, Jesus could not go out in public anymore. He couldn't go into a city publicly at all, but rather stayed out in the unpopulated areas. And while he went out to those areas, just like we saw in Capernaum, just like we saw in other places, and we'll continue to see, the people were coming to him from everywhere. Well, it is a very unusual command, first of all, that he would tell him not to say anything to anybody else, but go to the priest. Curious that he tells him not to tell anyone. Why not? There are a number of reasons why Jesus would have him be quiet. He tells the demons to be quiet. We discussed that a little bit last week. But it is an interesting call to silence there. There have been various reasons given for the silence. Uh, Wilhelm Wilhelm Schmidt, I think it's no Wilhelm no William Vrede. I got two different scholars mixed up from the early 20th century. William Vrede said that there was a messianic secret. This was part of Mark's plan to present the gospel of Jesus as a secret that had to be revealed. That has some merit. We do know that Jesus will not just tell the demons to be silent. He will tell this man not to tell anybody. There'll be others to say that he'll tell not to tell anybody. There could be a number of reasons. And at that point, it might be, again, one of those mysteries that we have about the Gospel of Mark, why he would do that. I think part of it here is that what Jesus goes on to tell him is to go and tell the priests. And his job is first to declare to the priest that he's been cleansed, show himself, because that's going to be a testimony to them. And that would be a practice. As soon as you were cleansed, you knew that you were healed. After you'd gone through a period of cleansing, you would go and show yourself to the priest, because they would then declare that you would be free and that you would be clean and that you could be re-entered and reintroduced into the community. Key here is Jesus' statement to the man that his action of going to the priest would be a testimony to them, to the priest. And then that raises another question. In what way would it be a testimony? Well, I think in one way it would be a testimony to the healing itself, because really it would be extremely rare someone to be healed of leprosy. We know in Jesus' ministry, he does it at least twice with this man and with a group of 10 on another occasion. But it was rare. And so this could be a testimony to the priest that there is something going on in town that they need to be hearing about. It would also draw their attention to Jesus beyond what they have already experienced, but also, and hopefully in a positive way. Jesus was going about doing good things. Also, it shows that Jesus is abiding by the law. This was what the law called for. As soon as someone would be healed of their leprosy, they were supposed to go to the priest to be declared clean. This is keeping it in line with the law of Moses. So Jesus was about keeping the law. We know in other places, and we'll see that coming up in the next chapter, that there will be times when he'll break their interpretation of the law, but he did keep the law of Moses. He often just interpreted it in such a way that they didn't approve of, because they didn't understand the spirit of the law. They were so focused on the letter of the law. So we ask the question, why does Jesus tell him to be secret? Part of it could be that he's got somewhere to go. He needs to do this first. I remember when I was younger, probably in college, I had thought this idea. Maybe it was just some reverse psychology. Jesus would tell him not to, knowing that the man was not going to obey, and that the message would spread about. And so Jesus would have his mission accomplished by other people hearing the message and him coming and them coming to him. Um, I don't know that that's the case. I really don't think Jesus was playing that kind of reverse psychology. In fact, it could be that he wanted to be the one to reveal it. I do know on many occasions that the people misunderstood what it was, what it meant for Jesus to be Messiah, and for that to happen before he had a chance to explain it could lead to a lot of misperception. It already had led to misperceptions along the way. We'll see that happen over and over again. But we do see here that not only does Jesus call the man to be silent, now the man is not silent. So the question on the other side is, why doesn't he obey? I think part of it is he's just excited about his healing. I don't know that you could say he forgot right away, um, but I think he's excited. And so he goes out and he tells people about Jesus. And of course, the result is that many, many more people start to come to Jesus, such that he's surrounded by crowds. And as Mark tells us, he's not able to go into public places without the crowds. And so what does he do? He goes into those secluded places, those unpopulated places, as the New American Standard would say. And he just knew that the more around crowds he would be, the more time he would need to spend in seclusion and in places of isolation to spend that time with his Father. But what happens? Even as he tries to find places to hide and be away for a while, again, never to do it for long periods of time. I mean, the passage opened up that we read this morning with the statement of Jesus himself that he needs to go into all these areas because that's why he came. He just needs to balance it with some of that private time with the Father. But the text ends this way, that even though he went into secluded places, the people came to him. And so we have the text end just like we had it begin. Jesus is off into a secluded place, and the people are coming after him. Here, Mark describes for us in general what Jesus would do. He would go about doing good, healing, preaching in the synagogues, casting out demons. But as his fame grew, as people started following him more, he had to try and get away. And there were times he would tell his disciples to do the same thing. But the result was, as this popularity grew, the people would go out and find him. And so, what I want you to think about moving forward is, before we get into some application here, is to think about what Mark is doing by telling us about Jesus. He'll show us more and more, bit by bit, as we hear about Jesus. Well, what are some applications we can make? As I've said, the focus of the Gospel of Mark is on Jesus. We need to focus on that. I do have one or two comments to make about ourselves at this point, but I do think it's important that we recognize that we think about what this is teaching us about Jesus. So one of the things I think is important from Mark is that we're getting more and more evidence of Jesus' power. Kingdom is coming. It's moving forward. It's showing that it's spreading. I think you're going to see this illustrated in a parable that Jesus gives of the secretly growing seed in the Gospel of Mark. We won't get there because we won't study that parable in our unit, but I'd like for you to think about that. It starts off small, but then explodes and grows really, really fast, really, really big. And that's what we're seeing Mark do here. He's showing us that with each event and with each series of events, Jesus is getting the message out and the word is spreading. Now, what you're going to see then, of course, is a mixture of response. You're going to see many, many come to faith. You're going to see many, many doubt and really raise opposition to him, especially among the religious leaders. But what Mark is doing is giving us more and more evidence of Jesus' power. Also, I think it's a sneak peek at Jesus' humanity. I know that many would look at the Gospel of Mark being the earliest gospel, if that is the case, and see that we have more of Jesus' humanity anyway. But I really think that as you read the first couple of chapters that we're looking at, and then chapter 3 in a few weeks, we get a sense of Jesus' divinity very, very clearly. The things that he's doing, only God can do. That becomes extremely evident in next week's lesson when we look at Jesus healing the man who was paralyzed. But we do get a peek at Mark's understanding of Jesus' humanity as he highlights his getting away and praying, finding places to get alone. That's evidence of his humanity. He's not a Superman, so to speak, that he can do these things without needing to get away. I think it also gives us insight into Jesus' understanding of his mission and how he's so focused on it. Remember that he was praying. Then, as the people came to him, as the people were looking for him, and the disciples got desperate and said, "Jesus, you've got to do something. They're all over looking for you." He says, "Let's go other places. I need to go into other nearby towns as well. That's why I came." So we know he understands his mission and his focus on it. I think also we need to recognize we're still trying to understand Jesus' method. Um, he does some things here in this passage that are difficult for us to understand. Why is he indignant if that's the proper reading of the text? But what is really clear in the text is that he would command this man not to say anything. You probably understand why the demons would be silenced. They would have no good thing to say. They would have no positive impact on the ministry of Jesus. They would be spreading the word in order to undermine Jesus. And so it's very clear why he would silence them. It's interesting that Jesus would call this man to silence and other people to silence. And by the way, I know we talked about the messianic secret in Mark, according to William Vreda. The fact is that there are other places in the other gospels where Jesus will tell the disciples, don't tell anybody. And he would tell other people, don't tell anybody this. And I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that there was a need for the message about his messianic fulfillment coming out bit by bit so that they would understand. As much as he waits, they still don't understand. But I do think it helps us to struggle with Jesus' methodology. He's going to do things differently than we would expect him to. What about us? Well, let me think about this. I mean, obviously, one option would be to apply the prayer time of Jesus to our own lives. And I'm not going to discount that. I think we need to do that. We all could start off 2021 increasing our prayer, increasing the quality of our prayer, certainly the need to pray. But I think here's something that's interesting from the man who was healed of his leprosy. Yes, he disobeys Jesus, but one of the things we see is his enthusiasm in going out and telling other people about Jesus, and his fame spread. One question I would have then is, what are we doing to increase the fame of Jesus? Certainly, he's already given the disciples and to us by extension the call to bear the message, to preach the gospel. So there's that part. What enthusiasm do we have? I convict myself at that point. I know that I need to be one who is out spreading the fame of Jesus. And I think also along those lines is not only spreading the fame of Jesus, but let's get correct information about Jesus out there. The problem is there is so much incorrect, false information about Jesus. And I think we need to be out there correcting the information about Jesus. Well, as we conclude, let me just ask you a couple of questions. What are your thoughts on the passage? One of the drawbacks, if you will, of Sunday school and Bible study going about this way is it's a one-way direction and it's a monologue in some ways. I hope that as I'm talking, your mind is thinking and your thoughts are spinning and you're coming up with some thoughts on your own. I know that you can't give me direct comment. You can always text me, of course. But what are your thoughts on this passage? What is coming to your mind as you're seeing the story and the narrative of Jesus unfold? I know that since we're going over 3 chapters over a 13-week period, we have a lot of time to think about that. And I think it's purposeful for us to stop down and focus on this. The Gospel of Mark is a familiar gospel. It's very tempting just to read it very fast, but slow down, read it again and again, and think about it. What are your thoughts? I would challenge you to not only think individually about this, but also interact with some tools out there that have given insight. Some people have given some insight into this. The other thing I would challenge you is to remember this is a part of a larger whole. And as it's very possible for you to go ahead and read the entirety of Gospel of Mark in a short time, and we can do it very quickly. It's valuable for us to stop down and read it piece by piece. We've said this before in other places with other texts. Remember, this is a part of a larger whole, and what we're seeing then is this is one story that's adding another piece to our understanding of who Jesus is. And we'll see another piece yet added next week. And so as we're closing, let me go ahead and have a word of prayer with you, and then I'll show you what our lesson for next week is going to be. Let's pray. Father, we thank you for this day. We thank you for the opportunity to study your word. We thank you for this new year. I just pray that as we enter into this new year, our focus would be on who you are and what your purpose for us is, not only as individuals, but as families committed to serving you, and as a Gambrell Street faith family to know what our mission is in our community and in the places where we work and among the other relationships that we have among other people. Lord, help us truly to be reflective upon what it is you would have us do this year. 2020 was a year like no other, and we don't know what 2021 will hold for us. But I pray that as 2020 concluded, we would look back on your faithfulness, be able to recognize that you have seen us through a lot. Uh, there have been many who have suffered greatly, and I just pray right now that all would be drawn to you, knowing of your faithfulness. And help us to be proactive in our prayer life, to seek you, to understand your will for our lives, and then help us to be courageous, to be obedient to what you've called us to do. I just pray you help us to worship you now, help us to honor you in all that we do this week, help us to continue to glorify you. Guide us by your Spirit. Continue to make us and mold us in the image of your Son, for it's in his name that we pray. Amen. Well, let me share with you real quickly what is going to be our lesson for next week. So pull that up. Next week, our lesson is going to be entitled Whatever It Takes. It's a very familiar story, Mark 2, verses 1 to 12. Quick heads up, this is the story of Jesus healing the man who was paralyzed, and his four friends brought him to Jesus in a very unique way. Well, as we conclude, I just want to take another opportunity to thank Dr. Spivey for reciting the passage for us. I'm very much admire the ability to do that. I need to do more scripture memory as well. I just really appreciate the ability and the impact it has for us to live it out as it's being recited to us. Well, I pray that you'll be ready for worship. I pray that you have a good week. And as always, I ask that you be well and be blessed. See you next time.